Lagos was a city where the rich ruled like gods and the poor were nothing but shadows. Towering skyscrapers stretched into the sky, roads gleamed with the shine of luxury cars, and high-rise mansions lined the coastline. The king's family was at the center of it all, dripping in wealth and power, untouchable by the law, worshipped by those who wanted a taste of their riches. John was just a driver, a nobody in their world, yet he had always been content. He was a simple man with simple dreams. He drove luxury cars he could never afford, working long hours for people who barely noticed his presence, but he never complained. He had a mother who prayed for him every morning, a fiancé who held his hands and spoke about the future, and a small apartment that was enough for him. He knew his place in the world, and he never stepped out of line. Rose Kings was different. She was born into a world where money solved everything: private jets, designer dresses, diamond-studded heels, parties that ended with shattered glass and secrets buried under hush money. She was beautiful, reckless, and cruel, the only daughter of Richard Kings, a billionaire who had built an empire of wealth. She had never heard the word no in her life. People feared her father too much to deny her anything. John had been her family's chauffeur for 2 years. He had watched her from a distance, driving her to her extravagant parties, seeing her stumble out of nightclubs with red-stained lips and empty eyes. She never acknowledged him beyond an impatient wave of her manicured hand. To her, he was invisible, until that night. It was late when John got the call. Rose needed a driver. Her usual one had called in sick. He didn't question orders, so he went. The club was a high-end one in Victoria Island, the kind of place where million-dollar deals were made in whispers, where men in tailored suits and women in silk gowns spent money without a second thought. He found her at the VIP lounge, laughing loudly, her gold dress glittering under the neon lights, her body pressed against a man who looked twice her age. Her glass was empty, but she swayed like she was drowning in alcohol. She saw John and smiled like they were old friends. She grabbed his wrist, pulling him close, her breath warm against his skin. "You came," she whispered. He stiffened. This wasn't normal. He had seen her drunk before, but never like this. She was too focused, her eyes locked onto his like she was seeing him for the first time. "Let's go," he said, trying to pull away. But she didn't let go. She traced a lazy finger down his arm, tilting her head. "You're always so serious, John, always so proper. It's boring." John swallowed. His mind screamed at him to get her out of there before she made a scene. The last thing he needed was to be caught in one of her reckless games. He loosened her grip gently. "We should go, Miss Kings, your father is waiting." She laughed, loud and mocking. "My father, always my father. Is that all you see when you look at me?" He didn't answer. He didn't want to play whatever game she was playing. She stumbled as he led her outside, her heels clicking against the pavement. The guards outside gave him a knowing look, one that made his stomach twist. They had seen men carry Rose out of places before, but this time it was different. This time it was him. She slid into the back seat of the Rolls-Royce, stretching out like a cat. The ride was silent until she leaned forward, her perfume filling the space between them. "You don't like me, do you?" John gripped the wheel. "That's not true, Miss Kings." "Then why do you act like I don't exist?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Because you and I don't live in the same world." She let out a small laugh. "But we're in the same car." He said nothing. She moved closer, her breath hot against his ear. "You don't have to pretend, John. I see the way you look at me." John's hands tightened on the wheel. He had never looked at her in any way. He had never even allowed himself to think about it. He knew better. He knew what happened to men who forgot their place. "Sit back, Miss Kings," he said firmly. She pouted but obeyed, leaning back, watching him through half-lidded eyes. "You're no fun." The rest of the ride was silent. When they arrived at the king's mansion, he stepped out, ready to help her inside, but she stumbled into him, her arms wrapped around his neck. "Don't you want me?" she whispered. John pulled away like he had been burned. "You're drunk, Miss Kings, go inside." Her eyes darkened. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Hurt, anger, rejection. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. She smirked, stepping back. "Good night, John." He nodded. got into the car, and drove away, shaking off the unease crawling up his spine. He didn't know it then, but that moment, his refusal, his rejection, had just sealed his fate. By morning, his world was in flames. The news spread like wildfire. The story was everywhere. Rose Kings, the billionaire's daughter, had been violated by her chauffeur. It was on every news station, every gossip blog, every headline. People whispered, cursed, debated. John was dragged from his apartment by the police before he could even understand what was happening. His mother screamed for him, tears streaming down her face as they pushed him into the police car. His fiancée stood frozen, eyes filled with horror and doubt. He begged, he swore he was innocent, but the evidence was overwhelming. Rose's torn dress, her sobbing confession, her father's fury. No one questioned her story, no one questioned the king's. John was sentenced in record time. 4 years in Kurikiri prison, 4 years for a crime he never committed. As they slammed the prison gates behind him, he realized the truth. It didn't matter who he was, it didn't matter what was real or what wasn't. In a world ruled by power, the truth meant nothing. And for the first time in his life, John felt something new. Hate, pure, burning, hate. The prison walls swallowed him whole, thick and suffocating, the air heavy with sweat and despair. The first thing he learned was that innocence had no place here. No one cared if you were guilty or not, no one cared about your story. The moment you walked through those gates, you became nothing, just another body in a sea of forgotten men. John didn't belong, but he had no choice. The first few weeks were a blur of hunger, pain, and fear. He was beaten more times than he could count, shoved into the filth of the overcrowded cells, forced to fight for every scrap of food. The guards were worse than the prisoners, power-drunk and cruel, treating them like animals. Letters from his mother stopped coming. Then one day, a guard threw a newspaper at him, laughing as he walked away. John picked it up, his heart already knowing before his eyes confirmed it. His mother was dead. She had collapsed in the market, clutching her chest, her heart giving out under the weight of grief. The only woman who had ever believed in him was gone. John sat in his corner that night, silent, staring at the stained walls of his prison. He didn't cry, he couldn't. Something inside him had shattered too deeply. His body ached, his face was bruised from the last fight, but the pain didn't matter anymore. The world outside had already buried him. His fiancée visited once. She sat across from him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't name. Guilt? Shame? Pity? He reached for her hands, but she pulled back. The words she said next would haunt him forever. I can't do this, John. I tried, but I can't. His fingers curled into fists as she looked away, her voice shaking. My family, people are talking. I have to move on. She left before he could say anything, before he could beg, before he could even breathe. The guards dragged him back to his cell, but he barely felt it. He lay on the cold floor, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment that led him here. Rose's laughter, the way she touched his arm, the way she had looked at him when he pushed her away. She had done this to him, she had lied, and the world had believed her. Time passed, but John stopped counting. The only thing that mattered was survival. He fought when he had to, learned who to avoid, and never spoke more than necessary. He became a shadow, slipping through the days, his heart growing colder with every breath. Then one day, it was over. A guard opened his cell, grinning like a hyena. You're free. John didn't move at first. The words didn't make sense. Free? How could he be free when he had already lost everything? The papers said he had served his time, 4 years, 4 long, brutal years, but when he stepped outside the gates, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't the same man who had walked in. The city moved around him, blinding lights, rushing cars, people laughing like the world had never stopped, but for him, it had. He walked through the streets, unnoticed, just another nameless face in the crowd. He had no home, no family, no one waiting for him. He passed by a large billboard with Rose King's face plastered on it, smiling like an angel. The caption read, Philanthropist of the Year. John clenched his fists so tightly his nails bit into his skin. She was still thriving, still adored, still powerful. She had stolen his life and the world had rewarded her. As he stood there, staring at the image of the woman who had destroyed him, he felt it rise inside him like fire, slow and steady, burning away the last of his humanity. Hate wasn't enough. Revenge. That was the only thing left. And he would take his time. John disappeared into the underbelly of Lagos, where whispers traveled faster than the wind and secrets were currency. He had nothing, no home, no family, no name that carried weight, but he had time, and time was all he needed. The city moved on without him, but he had never moved on. The kings had erased him, buried him alive, but they had made one mistake: they had left him breathing. He spent weeks studying them from the shadows, watching, listening. The king's empire was not as powerful as it once was. The financial empire Richard Kings had built with steel and deception was cracking at the foundation. Their names still opened doors, but fewer than before. Investors were pulling back. Business partners whispered about corruption and failed deals. Rose Kings, once the princess of Lagos high society, was now nothing more than a fallen star. She had been the golden girl, the woman every man wanted, every woman envied. But power is a fickle thing, and when it slips, the world watches, waiting for you to fall. John had expected her to still be untouchable, but she wasn't. The headlines told the story: failed business ventures, a scandalous breakup with an oil magnate's son, rumors of debt, reckless spending. The people who had once worshipped her had turned their backs. Even her father's influence couldn't protect her from public scorn. Society had grown tired of her. The same men who once fought for a place at her side now whispered that she was a liability. Women who had pretended to be her friends now laughed behind her back. She was sinking, but she was still breathing, and that was unacceptable. John had spent 4 years being nothing. Now, it was his turn to become someone. The first step was getting close. He needed access to the kings, and that meant slipping into their crumbling empire like a shadow. He reached out to an old friend, someone who owed him a debt, a man who knew the right people. Soon, John found himself inside one of the smaller companies owned by the kings, a junior executive, a nobody in a suit, but invisibility was his greatest weapon. Every day, he listened. He sat in meetings where men in expensive suits spoke of losses and damage control. He watched as Richard Kings fought to keep his empire from falling apart, signing bad deals, trusting the wrong people, grasping at power like a drowning man reaching for air. John studied him the way a predator studies its prey. Richard was arrogant, too proud to admit he was losing, but John saw it, the desperation in his eyes, the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. He was weak, and weak men made mistakes. Then came the first move. John leaked documents, just enough to cause a scandal, but not enough to destroy them completely. The news broke overnight. The king's empire was accused of fraud, shady business dealings, corruption. The stock plummeted, investors panicked, news channels replayed the story on a loop. Richard Kings went into damage control, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. And John was just getting started. While Richard fought to salvage his empire, Rose was fighting her own battles. She was spiraling, drinking too much, making reckless decisions. She had lost her glow, the effortless charm that once made people forgive her sins. Now, they only saw the cracks, the desperation, the fear. She still walked with her head high, still wore diamonds and silk, but the world had stopped looking at her with admiration. Now, they watched with amusement, waiting for her to fall completely. And that was when John made his next move. A chance meeting, carefully planned, a staged introduction at an elite charity event. She didn't recognize him. How could she? The John she had destroyed was gone. The man standing before her now was different, sharper, stronger, untouchable. He wore power like a second skin. His voice was steady, his eyes unreadable. When their hands met in greeting, her gaze lingered just a second too long. John Cole, he introduced himself, offering a small, calculated smile. Cole, she repeated, testing the name on her tongue, as if searching her memory, but there was nothing for her to find. She let the moment slip away. Have we met before? Maybe in another life, he said smoothly. She laughed, a tired, bitter sound. you believe in second lives. I believe in second chances, he replied. That was all it took. She was intrigued. He let her think she had found him, that fate had placed him in her path. She had lost so much: her friends, her influence, the security that had once wrapped around her like a shield, and now, here was a man who didn't seem to judge her, a man who didn't look at her with pity or disdain, a man who saw her, not for the scandal, but for something else. It was a game, a careful, patient game. John became a presence in her life, but never too much. He let her come to him, let her seek him out. It started with small conversations, a drink here, a shared silence there. He played his role well. He was a mystery, a man who didn't ask for anything, who listened without offering false comfort. He watched as she let her guard down, little by little. The deeper he went, the more he saw the cracks in her. She wasn't the same girl who had laughed that night in the back of his car, the girl who had whispered lies and ruined his life. She was broken now, drowning in her own mistakes. There were moments he almost felt pity, almost. But then he would remember Kirikiri, the bruises, the cold, hard floor, his mother's grave, the betrayal in his fiancée's eyes, the years he could never get back. No, there was no pity, only purpose. Rose confided in him one night, her voice thick with wine, her body slumped on a velvet couch in her penthouse. They hate me, you know, she murmured, swirling the liquid in her glass. Everyone, they're just waiting for me to lose everything. He sat across from her, his expression unreadable. Why do you care? She let out a breathy laugh, but it was hollow. Because I'm Rose Kings, I don't lose. John studied her, then don't. She met his eyes, something desperate flickering in her gaze. And if I do? He tilted his head, watching her, his voice quiet, steady. Then make sure you take them down with you. She stared at him, something unreadable passing over her face. Then she smiled, slow and knowing. And just like that, she trusted him. It was over before she even realized it had begun. He was inside now, closer than he had ever been. She needed him, relied on him, confided in him, and he used every second of it, every moment, every secret, every whisper. The king's empire was collapsing, and Rose was standing at the edge. John was going to be the one to push her over. John watched as Rose clung to the illusion of control, gripping onto whatever was left of her name like a drowning woman gasping for air. She didn't realize the walls were already closing in, that her empire was no longer hers, that the power she once held was slipping through her fingers. She thought she was playing the game, but she was the one being played. Every move she made, every secret she shared, every desperate attempt to hold on only brought her closer to the end. The cracks in the king's empire widened. Richard Kings fought like a man cornered, striking deals with the wrong people, trusting vultures who only circled to pick apart the carcass of his failing legacy. The business world smelled weakness, and in a city like Lagos, weakness was fatal. Stocks continued to fall, contracts were lost, investors withdrew, and the media was relentless. The once invincible name of the king's family was now attached to scandal after scandal, and the public, always hungry for the fall of the mighty, tore into them like rabid dogs. John made sure of it. Whispers found their way to the press, anonymous sources leaked damaging reports, and old skeletons were pulled from the shadows. Deals made in darkness were exposed in the light. Every mistake, every deception, every fraudulent transaction that had been buried was brought to the surface. He fed their enemies, armed their critics, and left them defenseless. And through it all, he stayed by Rose's side, the only thing she had left that felt solid. She leaned on him, confided in him, trusted him. She never questioned how he always seemed to know what she needed, never realized that the comfort he gave was laced with poison, that the support he offered was nothing more than a knife held to her back. She had no one else. Her friends had abandoned her, unwilling to be dragged down with her. High society had cast her out, no longer entertained by her presence. The men who once wanted her now ignored her, treating her like a discarded trophy. Even her father, once her protector, now saw her as a liability. "You're becoming a disgrace," Richard Kings told her one evening, his voice sharp with frustration as he paced his office. "You were supposed to carry the king's name, not drag it through the mud." Rose, sitting on the couch with a glass of whiskey, laughed bitterly. "Oh, I'm sorry, father, is my life ruining your business?" He slammed his fist on the desk. "Your life is the business, everything you do reflects on this family, and you have done nothing but embarrass yourself." She took a slow sip of her drink, unfazed. "Then fix it. I've spent years fixing your mistakes." His voice dropped lower, colder. "Maybe it's time you fix this one yourself." For the first time in her life, Rose Kings felt abandoned. That night, she drank too much, called John at 2 a.m., slurring his name as she asked him to come over. When he arrived, she was curled up on the floor of her penthouse, her phone shattered against the wall, her makeup smeared like war paint. She looked up at him with tired, bloodshot eyes. "Tell me the truth, John, do you think I deserve this?" He crouched down beside her, his expression unreadable. "What do you think?" She exhaled shakily, her fingers tightening around her glass. "I don't know anymore." That was the moment he knew she was breaking. The next step was easy. John orchestrated the final blow carefully, methodically. A major business deal, one of the last lifelines for the king's empire, fell apart under mysterious circumstances. Millions were lost in a single day. Rumors spread that Richard Kings had been betrayed from within, that someone close had been leaking information, sabotaging his recovery efforts. Investors pulled out completely, and the king's name became untouchable. Banks froze accounts, legal threats loomed. Richard Kings was finished. And then the final move, Rose's downfall, the moment that would leave her with nothing. John led her into a trap so perfectly crafted that she walked into it blindly, trusting him every step of the way. A business deal, a promise of redemption, one last chance to regain control of her life. She was desperate, too blind to see the strings he was pulling. He introduced her to the right people, men who pretended to help but had only come to watch her fall. She signed papers without reading them, agreed to terms she didn't understand, believing that John would never let her make a mistake. When the truth came out, it was too late. The deal had been fraudulent. She was accused of financial misconduct, of fraud, of using company funds for personal gain. The media devoured the story, the public condemned her, her father disowned her, the authorities got involved. She was no longer just a fallen socialite, she was a criminal in the eyes of the world. She ran to John, the only person left, the only one who hadn't abandoned her. She found him at his apartment, panic in her eyes, her hands shaking. "You have to help me," she whispered. John stood there, silent, his face unreadable. She reached for him, desperate. "Please, I don't have anyone else." He looked at her for a long moment, then finally spoke. "I know." And that was when she understood. The betrayal hit her like a gunshot. She staggered back, her breath shallow, her mind racing to put the pieces together. "No, no, you wouldn't." He said nothing, he just watched. The silence was louder than any confession. Her body trembled as realization crashed into her. "It was you," her voice cracked, "all of it, the leaks, the scandals, the deal, you set me up." John tilted his head slightly, his expression never changing. "I never lied to you, Rose." She stumbled back, her world spinning, her knees almost giving out. "Who are you?" He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, lowering his voice just enough to make sure she heard every word. "I'm the man you sent to prison." Rose's breath caught, her face paled. John watched as the truth shattered her completely. He saw it in the way her shoulders collapsed, in the way her lips parted in disbelief, in the way tears welled in her eyes but never fell. He had seen this moment in his head 1,000 times, imagined how it would feel, how satisfying it would be to watch her break the way she had broken him. But something was different. She didn't fight back, she didn't scream, she didn't deny it, she just stood there, silent, as if accepting the weight of what she had done. That was the moment John realized something he hadn't expected. She already knew she deserved this. She had known for a long time. And somehow, that made the victory feel hollow. Rose stood frozen, her body trembling, her breath coming in short, broken gasps. The weight of the truth crushed her, pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. she had spent years running from her past, burying the guilt, convincing herself that what she did to John was just another problem money could make disappear. But now, standing before the man she had destroyed, seeing the cold triumph in his eyes, she realized something terrifying. There was no escaping this. John watched her, waiting for the fight, the denial, the anger, but none of it came. She just stood there, staring at him with something worse than fear, acceptance. She let out a shaky breath. You win. John felt something twist inside him. He had dreamed of this moment for years, imagined how it would feel to see her ruined, abandoned, desperate, but now that it was here, it didn't taste as sweet as he thought it would. The fire inside him didn't roar with satisfaction, it flickered, uncertain. She turned away, her voice barely above a whisper. I deserve this, don't I? He wanted to say yes, he wanted to throw every ounce of pain back at her, to make her suffer the way he had suffered, but the words didn't come. Instead, he saw flashes of the past, his mother's lifeless body, the cold floors of Kurikiri prison, the betrayal in his fiancée's eyes. He had spent years drowning in hate, allowing it to shape him into something else, something ruthless, and now, standing here, looking at the shell of the woman who had once held power over his life, he felt nothing. No rage, no relief, just emptiness. She turned back to him, something fragile in her expression. Was this enough? Her voice wavered. Did it fix what I did to you? John's jaw tightened. Nothing could ever fix what she had done, nothing could give him back the years he lost, but he had taken everything from her now. She had nothing left, no power, no friends, no empire. And maybe that was enough. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the wreckage of the life she once controlled. He didn't look back, he didn't need to. Rose Kings was already gone.